Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for making time to be here this morning on what promises to be a great conversation here at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. I'm Steve Edwards. I am the Deputy Director of Programming, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the final in a series of conversations we've had this week under the billing and umbrella of Democracy Week, as we've explored various structural elements of democracy in America today. That series and today's overall session is underwritten with the generous support of the Joyce Foundation, so we're grateful to them for all they've done to make these and the other sessions this week possible. We encourage those of you who've never been to an Institute of Politics event before, especially those of you who may be outside the campus community, to check out our website at politics.uchicago.edu. You'll get a list of everything that we have going on, plus you can sign up for our email list. We also encourage you to follow us on Twitter at UChiPolitics. At UChiPolitics, rather. I also want to point out Joe Scarborough will be signing books after this event. But without further ado, let me introduce the man who's going to be welcoming both Joe and David Axelrod to the stage. He's Jonathan Godoy, who's a third year at the college here. He is also very active in the Institute of Politics. He's also active in a number of other fashions as the publications editor of Counterpoint, a conservative magazine on campus, and is writing for the Chicago Journal of Foreign Policy. This past summer, he interned in the offices of Senator Marco Rubio and Representative Paul Ryan. So please join me without further ado in welcoming Jonathan Godoy. Jonathan?
Thank you, Steve. The last half of the 20th century in American politics proved to be fairly successful for the Republicans. What began in the 1950s with the successful courting and election of a World War II war hero culminated with a record-setting landslide election of an iconic conservative figure as president in Reagan, and a Republican resurgence that led to the retaking of Congress in 1994. And while the turn of the 21st century, albeit muddled in electoral confusion, saw similar promise with a brand of new conservatism called compassionate conservatism, the unpopular and divisive politics of war and economic turmoil ultimately left the party with a bleak outlook. Since then, it seems as if the party, despite the electoral successes in 2010, has failed to capture the aura that catapulted it to success in years past. Cue then former Republican representative and current MSNBC anchor Joe Scarborough in his new book entitled The Right Path, From Ike to Reagan, How Republicans Once Mastered Politics and Can Again. Mr. Scarborough's book, in analyzing the rhetorical and governing strategies that won the approval and electoral support of the American populace between 1952 and 1988, prescribes for the modern-day Republican Party a new way forward that can to help them regain the prestige and political prowess that they once held. Today, we are honored to be joined by him and Institute of Politics Director David Axelrod to listen to, discuss, and debate his analysis and recommendations. So without any further ado, please give a warm welcome to Joe Scarborough and David Axelrod.
It's okay. It's okay. He let me know out there that there are more people who are officially identified as Marxists than Republicans around here. And I said, hey, I work at MSNBC. I feel like home.
I always remind people, the home of Milton Friedman, Friedman Economics.
Yeah.
We've got a good contingent.
Yeah.
We've got a good contingent of Republicans here. Speaking of which,
yes.
First of all, let me. I explained to Joe I've got to go to a fundraiser in New York tonight. Otherwise, I would have dressed down to match Joe. I don't want to. I don't want him to feel self-conscious, which I don't think he would. Yeah. But let me ask you about. Let's start actually with you and how you came up in politics and what motivated you and what has changed and what particularly has changed in the Republican Party since you ran for Congress in 1994.
I had three political heroes. One obviously was Ronald Reagan. Another was Harry Truman. And the third was Bobby Kennedy. And I got to say, at the moment I decided to run for office was when I was reading Arthur Schlesinger's book on Bobby Kennedy. And he told this story, the amazing story of Indianapolis, where, Bobby was in Indianapolis the night Martin Luther King was assassinated. And everybody told him he couldn't go into the inner city. It was too dangerous. He had to stay in his hotel room because there were going to be riots across Indianapolis and also across America. Bobby Kennedy, being Bobby Kennedy, basically told them where to go. He went on in with his people, and he was going to stick to his campaign schedule. And Schlesinger paints the picture of Bobby's car going in to the center of Indianapolis, and the police car stopping and letting him go in alone, where he went in alone. And Bobby Kennedy went in and gave what Jeff Greenfield said, who was a speechwriter, said, we always hated him for this. Bobby Kennedy then proceeded to give the greatest speech of his life, probably one of the greatest political speeches of the 20th century. And he did it off the top of his head, speaking to people aggrieved who had lost their last best hope in Martin Luther King. And, you know, in reading that, I think I was 16, 17 years old. I read that and I said, oh my God, I was a conservative guy, but I said, here is a guy who actually bent history. And Schlesinger went on to say that that night, Los Angeles erupted in flames. That night, New York erupted in flames. That night, scores of cities went up in flames. That night, Indianapolis went to sleep in peace. And they did because of one man's courage. And you multiply that a few times over, we don't need 435 people like that in Congress. I'll take 10. It would make, I think it would make a big difference. So that was an inspiration.
As I always point out, though, Profiles in Courage was a slim book for a reason, you know, that there's not...
Exactly. Exactly. But, and Reagan, of course, I was inspired by Reagan in 1981 for the same reason a lot of young people were inspired by Reagan. We seemed to be a country that was in decline. We seemed to be a weak country. You had the Iranian hostage crisis. You had interest rates at 21%. We seemed to be a country out of control, and Reagan came in and was a forceful leader and inspired me. My problem now, though, you asked where the Republican Party is right now. I'm asked this question on this book tour time and time again. Would Ronald Reagan be able to survive in a primary today? That's a great question. That's an unanswered question because we haven't seen a Republican like Reagan run who was strong enough to stand down the extremists, the way Bill Buckley did, by the way. Bill Buckley took on, it took him a while, but he took on the John Birchers. And Ronald Reagan, took on the Birchers too, and other extremists that are trying to control our party right now. And Reagan had a very, straightforward approach. He said, they can vote for me if they want to. But when they vote for me, they're a member of my party. I'm not a member of their party.
Well, Reagan, the reason you get asked that question is Reagan signed what was considered a fairly liberal abortion law when he was governor. He signed 11 tax increases when he was president. He signed an immigration bill that was far more liberal than the one that's being debated in Congress today. Right. And today, though, there seems to be litmus tests in the Republican Party, and you've seen nominees, the last two Republican nominees, dragged way far to the right on issues like immigration, on issues like women's health, on issues like gay marriage.
And these were guys who were fairly moderate by Republican standards.
Absolutely.
They got dragged to a position where they were uncomfortable, and you could see it on the campaign trail in 2008 and 2012.
You mentioned Bobby Kennedy. The fact is Bobby Kennedy, he challenged his own president on the war, but he also challenged democratic orthodoxy on welfare and on a series of other issues, and was willing to do that. And that's where's that impetus in your party today?
And that's the biggest problem. And it's not just me saying this. We went after the election, after you guys hounded us again. It's getting old.
Not to me, but
of course it's not to you. But seriously, could we just pass you the ball so you take the layup and be done with it? The National Review had a symposium where a lot of conservatives got together and we talked about what the problem in the party was. And it shocked me that every person there said the same thing, that we don't have the debates anymore within our own party about the best approach to immigration, the best approach to welfare, the best approach to health care, the best approach to foreign policy. You either toe a very tight line or else you're deemed a rhino. I think we're moving past that a little bit. I think if there was any positive to the government shutdown and the Republican Party's numbers crashing to 18% approval in the CBS poll and all-time lows in the Gallup poll and the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, it's the fact now that people understand that we can't listen to the most extreme voices in our party. There's a guy whose name I won't say here, who...
Initials or...
yeah, I just can't do it. Sorry. I gave this up about 6 months ago because I realized it did me no good. But there is, I will just say, a national conservative figure who the day after Chris Christie was elected said, well, he's not a conservative. Somebody asked, why don't you think he's a conservative? He said, because he doesn't have the guts to call the president a liar. The president's a liar, and if he's afraid to say that, he's not a conservative. To which I said the next day on the show, well, Ronald Reagan never called Jimmy Carter a liar. Because you want to be conservative ideologically if you're a Republican and moderate temperamentally. Don't go around hating. The hate, going around calling the President of the United States a liar may excite some people in talk radio. It's not going to really win you the I-4 corridor or the burbs of Philadelphia or of Chicago. Somebody sent me an email the next day, though, and said, well, Reagan actually did call Jimmy Carter a liar. I said, no, he didn't. Then they sent me a quote, and this was the Reagan quote that they were holding on to. We had the energy crisis in the 1970s, and Jimmy Carter liked telling people, oh, I love turning the thermostat down to 67 and taking cold showers in the morning. It wakes me up. To which Ronald Reagan said, any man who tells you that he likes starting the day with a cold shower will lie about anything. And that was Reagan, as you know very well. Right. You saw the guy going up. And you talked about the things that Reagan did. Reagan signed some bills that conservatives didn't like then and would absolutely hate now. But Tip O'Neill's son said the only thing that Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan hated more than each other's ideology was gridlock. They felt like they were elected to get things done and to move this country forward.
But, Joe, it seems like there is a contingent within the Republican caucus, particularly in the House, right, but there's some in the Senate as well. You guys always talk about being small government conservatives, but these seem to be no government conservatives. They believe that compromise is betrayal, and that right, the smaller with Grover Norquist, that if he said, let's shrink the government to the size where we can drown it in right, the bathtub.
But even Grover Norquist during the government shutdown said this is foolish. I mean, these guys and women have jumped the shark so much that they don't represent the mainstream, not only of America, but of the Republican Party. I've got to say, when we got elected in 1994, we were like that for about a year and a half. And then Bill Clinton kicked our ass. He figured out how to punish us for doing what we did. And, we've got an old saying in Northwest Florida that there's no education in the second kick of a mule. You get kicked the first time, it is a learning process. You get kicked the second time, you're probably too stupid to hang out around a barn. Well, I said to a lot of these guys that were running this thing in the Senate and the House, I said, guys, I can tell you how this ended. We tried this. And you think you hate Barack Obama? Nobody hated Bill Clinton more than I did. And it got in my way. And I just wanted to bring him down. And what I found is, all we did was re-elect him. As you know, Clinton would drive me crazy. He'd be like, I feel your pain. Be like, he's lying. You know he's lying. And then he meets you, How many people here have met Bill Clinton before?
Wow.
See, you ask this. I ask this in every crowd, right? And usually you ask, hey, have you met a president before? One or two people in a crowd like this will raise their hand. Everybody's met Bill Clinton. It's like a Beach Boys song. He gets around. And when you meet him, he's all, I sure do love you. I mean, his hands are all up. It doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. It's unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it.
So,
And I felt bad about hating him. I'm not done yet, David. I'm not done. I got a 3-hour show.
I'm beginning to identify with
And
Mika
I remember telling Erskine Bowles, I feel really bad about hating your boss the way I do. And Erskine said, don't worry about it, Congressman. He hates you too. But there's a lesson there, to which it's very funny. Bill Clinton and I were loving on each other one day on TV last year, and you emailed me and you said, excuse me, Joe, you did impeach this guy, you know. I said it was the 90s, David. It seemed like the thing to do. But we got things done.
Yeah.
We balanced the budget. We passed welfare reform. We passed tax reform. We passed regulatory reform.
So you got
We're
kicked
missing that
You
now.
got kicked by the mule.
And learn.
And John Boehner got kicked by the mule as well. He was there at that time.
He did.
How, as the Speaker of the House, then, does he allow them to go over the same cliff?
Well, I think, you know, I can't speak for John. I know him and I like him, but I'll tell you, I wouldn't be Speaker that way. You know, you can't live your life scared. You can't be a leader being afraid that extremists in your midst are somehow going to throw you overboard. At some point, you have to realize that, you know, power, the definition of power is making people do what they naturally wouldn't do. And either John Boehner has the power as a leader and authority as a leader to go to him beforehand and say all the things that Charles Krauthammer and Scott Walker, Tom Coburn, Paul Ryan, and myself were saying, which is a disaster waiting to happen. Don't do it. Either he's got the courage to do that or he doesn't. And if he doesn't, why continue as Speaker of that House?
But one of the reasons that we didn't avoid the shutdown was that the so-called Hastert rule that even Hastert has renounced, which says that you have to have a majority of Republicans to put something on the floor. Obviously, ultimately, he waived that, but late in the game. It seems like the Hastert rule, we have a filibuster in the Senate, a filibuster rule in the Senate. Now we have a filibuster rule in the House,
right, where
a minority of the House can keep a bill from coming to the floor. You didn't have that rule when you were
No, we didn't. But as Speaker of the House, I'm sure you realize you have to be careful about how many times you're going to be willing to roll your members and say, hey, if you're Nancy Pelosi, to say, hey, you know what, I can't pass this with a majority of Democrats, so I'll just get Republicans, conservative Republicans, to help me pass this. It's a balancing act, but I don't think it can be a hard, fast rule.
She actually, though, was pretty skillful at making sure that she had the votes that she needed. What's your assessment of her as a legislative leader?
What's
Pelosi.
That? Oh my God, she's tough as hell. And I will tell you, Nancy Pelosi never had to worry about Democrats following her.
Right.
Tip O'Neill never did. Newt didn't for about 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. And then we eventually caught up to him. But again, people, I think, are so hungry for strong leadership that you would have a lot of these Tea Party members in the House who would follow a strong leader if they said, this is what we're doing, this is our goal, this is where we're going, this is our long-term strategy. What I hear from a lot of my friends in the House is that John Boehner doesn't communicate with them. They don't hear from him. They don't hear from their regular leaders. It's so screwed up in the House of Representatives now and in the Senate, because they haven't been operating under regular order now for years. They don't pass bills. The Senate, I don't think the Senate's passed a single appropriation bill this year. The House has only passed 3 or 4. So they just basically go there and sit around and wait for these budget battles to be resolved in back rooms.
You mentioned the kick of a mule. the old expression that it takes that any jackass can kick down the barn. It takes a carpenter to build one. So in that spirit, what is it that the Republican Party stands for today? And if you can't say, then what should it stand for? What on some of these major issues? Where should the Republican Party be? Where would Ronald Reagan have the Republican Party today? Obviously, strong leadership is necessary, but where are you leading? What are the answers to some of these questions?
Well, I think if you want to look and see what the Republican Party stands for, don't look to Washington, D.C., but you can look outside of Washington, D.C. and see a pretty vibrant Republican Party. We control 60% of, the governor's mansions. We control a majority of the state Senate seats. We control a majority of the state House seats across the country. And you've got people like John Kasich and people like Scott Walker, people like Chris Christie, that have made a lot of really tough decisions over the past 2 or 3 or 4 years that I really wish leaders in Michigan and Detroit would have made about 25 years ago. And that I hope leaders in Washington, D.C. will have the guts to make over the next 10 years. We've talked about it since President Obama was first sworn in, and that is do what we have to do to save Medicare and Medicaid for another generation, for all of you. So obviously, we're supposed to be fiscally conservative. The Republican Party in Washington, D.C. hasn't been that over the past decade. George W. Bush took a $155 billion surplus. He turned it into a $1.5 trillion deficit, doubled the national debt, spent $7 trillion on a Medicare drug benefit plan, didn't pay for a single dime of it. We're supposed to be fiscally responsible. Republicans are supposed to be like Colin Powell in foreign policy. You get into wars as a last resort, and when you do go to war, you throw everything you have at that war. You use overwhelming force, you achieve your goals and objectives, and then you come home. We are not supposed to be an occupying nation. We have occupied countries now for 12 years, and it's time to bring that to an end. As you know, David, we disagreed about... You certainly disagreed with me on Iraq for the first 2 or 3 years of the Iraq War. I was wrong. You were right. I've disagreed with this administration.
Are we taping this? Is this?
You've disagreed. I've disagreed with this administration since 2009 on Afghanistan. I don't think we should have tripled the number of troops. I don't think we should be spending $2 billion a week in Afghanistan, and I haven't for years. But obviously, you guys inherited a mess brought to you by a Republican administration, so that's a mitigating factor, but we have got to stop rebuilding other countries, and we've got to start rebuilding our own. We've got to start. What else should Republicans stand for? They should stand for taking care of the 75% or so of the budget that's going to continue to explode and bankrupt us as a nation, and stop just cutting from the 10, 11, 12% of the budget that doesn't impact senior citizens who vote and come out in large numbers. We can't keep cutting in areas where the Chinese are doubling down, whether you talk about infrastructure, you talk about education, or you talk about R&D. I love talking about Ike because Ike is a Republican hero that I think other Republicans are waking up to. I was excited to see the National Review even wrote a cover story about him, talking about the greatness of Eisenhower, considering that the National Review was founded by William F. Buckley and other people that hated Eisenhower. But Ike, after Sputnik, decided he was going to invest in science. Do they know what Sputnik was?
Yes. I think
all right, well, if you don't, Google it.
You know what Google is, right?
Yeah. But Eisenhower decided in 1957, after the Soviets set up Sputnik, that he was going to invest in science and mathematicians and engineers. And he poured money into it. And you got a lot of people went to school on scholarships to study science, math, engineering. Because of what he did, JFK was able to say 4 or 5 years later, by the end of the decade, we're going to send a man to the moon. And when we did on that July night in 1969, you know what the average age of the people in Mission Control were? 28 years old. And it didn't end there. After they retired from NASA, they went out into the workforce, and they helped grow this economy. With all due respect to Al Gore, they helped create and develop the internet. They did great things for this country, and it all started with an investment from a Republican president and a Republican Congress. And we can't keep cutting the 10, 11, 12% of the budget that should be not only investment, but also takes care of the most disadvantaged among us. Yeah. And John Kasich's learning that in Ohio, by the way.
I would go further back to the original Republican. You're in the land of Lincoln, of course. Yeah. And, presidents talked about this. In the midst of the Civil War, where the fate of the country was hanging in the balance, Lincoln still invested in the Transcontinental Railroad, he started the National Science Foundation, started land-grant colleges, because he understood that these things would be necessary to grow the country and grow the economy and create opportunity in the future. That's the legacy of the original Republican Party. But as you point out,
and can I say really quickly though, as I talk about this, I'm not talking about this because I'm sitting next to you about us needing to invest, or because I'm in an area that apparently there are more Marxists than Republicans. God bless you, sir, for surviving. I always wanted my son to go to Berkeley and be the head of the college Republicans in Berkeley.
What do you have against your son?
I should have sent him up here. He went to the University of Alabama instead. But I say this to Republicans, and I've been saying this to Republicans for years. And do you know what Republicans say? Yeah, that sounds about right to me. I'm telling you, the most extreme voices in our party could not withstand a strong presidential candidate that actually had the courage to stand up and speak out against this no government nonsense. I'm for small government. I am. I support going after wasteful programs a lot more than you would and most people in this room would. But small government is not no government. And that's right now where a faction of our party is.
Right. And probably more dominant than the mainstream, certainly than the mainstream of the country, maybe the mainstream of Republicans in the country.
Right.
So we talked about this a little bit earlier. Chris Christie is the flavor of the month. He won a big victory in a blue state. He's a powerful personality, and yet he was on television last weekend, and when he was asked questions about specific issues, he took a pass on them, Iran and some other issues. Can he be that person if he doesn't answer those questions?
Well, I personally don't think he should even be answering those questions or doing the interviews for another year or so. Obviously, he's going to get out on the road in 2014 and campaign for other candidates. He'll be asked then those questions, and then he should answer those questions. But I think when you get elected, or reelected especially, keep your head down and do your job and let other people talk about you.
Let me ask you about some things that will set. I said to the president, and some of you have probably heard me say this before, but I said to the president the day after the midterm elections that this was a blessing in disguise. I actually didn't say that. I felt that the seeds of his reelect had been planted. And the reason I mentioned blessing in disguise is because I think of the old Churchill story where Churchill says,
Clementine says to him after he loses as prime minister, after beating Nazi Germany, "Well, Winston, it might be a blessing in disguise."
And he said it's rather well disguised.
We do this, by the way, on the road. If you want to pay us bar mitzvahs, Rotary Club meetings, I play Clementine, and he plays Winston.
But we are becoming a more diverse country.
Right.
And yet the Republican Party, Mitt Romney lost Hispanic voters. He got 27%. Right. A dismal showing. Lost Asian voters by even more. Lost African-American voters by even more than that. By the middle of this century, non-Hispanic whites are going to be a minority in this country. Can the Republican Party sustain itself without moderating its positions on some of these issues, like immigration reform, for example?
Well, they can't be seen as reflexively anti-immigrant or anti-immigrant reform. I think the most troubling group, demographic group, where you could really see that this was spreading, not just among African Americans who we've had a dismal record with since Richard Nixon was getting, 20, 25, 30% of the African American vote, or even Hispanics, who had a reason to run away in record numbers because of what Mitt Romney said in Iowa, and because Rick Perry, for God's sake, was decried as a liberal for talking about being compassionate to illegal immigrants. But Asian Americans, if Asian Americans are reflexively voting against Republicans, and we're not passing legislation or not saying things that specifically targets Asian Americans, it shows just how white and old and insulated our party was in 2012. Now, do I think this is a condition that is going to stay with the Republican Party over the next 10, 20 years? It depends on what the Republican Party decides to do with it. I think one of Mitt Romney's problems, and you understood this because you guys started beating the hell out of him in May, June, July, August in Ohio. Mitt Romney will say that the 47% video was a gaffe. But it wasn't. As Mitt Romney proved after the election in a phone call. I like Mitt, and I like Ann, and I like their family. They're really good, decent people. And I think you'll agree with me
I would.
there.
Yes, I would.
Good, decent people, a great man. But politically, he's tone deaf. And Mitt Romney believes, like too many people in Washington, D.C. right now, and my party believe, that they believe in that 47% America. They really do. Whereas somebody like Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, who was a shopkeeper's daughter, believed, whether you believe it or not, they believed that lower taxes and lower regulations and giving small business owners more freedom to run their business, and Americans and British to run their lives the way they wanted to run their lives with minimal government interference, they believed, like I believe, that helps a 17-year-old Latino in South Central LA as much as it helps a 65-year-old white hedge fund broker in Greenwich, Connecticut. And if you believe that, and if you can articulate that, and if you can fight for that like Ronald Reagan could, and like Margaret Thatcher could, then you can get Americans of all stripes voting for you.
Yeah.
Because I reject outright that Hispanics or African Americans or Asian Americans somehow don't want to pursue the American dream as aggressively as old white hedge fund guys in Greenwich. And this idea that somehow we are doomed, I think overlooks the fact that we had a candidate in 2012 that doomed us. And also that said some things in the primary that so isolated
Which
him.
was the price he paid to get the nomination. On your point,
But
though,
that's too high of a price to pay.
I couldn't agree more. And if I had been advising him, I would have said it's better not to get the nomination than get it on those terms.
Right.
But I don't think he probably got that advice.
I don't think he did.
on the larger point, though, here's the difference between the period of Reagan and Thatcher and today. We had a financial crisis. I don't think anybody would argue that we had that crisis because we had too much regulation and too much oversight.
Right.
Secondly, we have economic changes that are being driven by this incredible warp speed increase in technology and productivity. And so, I had a conversation with a Romney supporter, and I said, I think the biggest challenge of our time is how we create an economy in which the American dream still lives and where people can work hard and get ahead, and there's a good, solid middle class. And all of these changes have created this gulf. And he said that's wrong because productivity, because technology and productivity, they create jobs. jobs. They don't destroy jobs. The point is they don't create jobs for the people who have lost their jobs.
They don't create enough jobs. They take away jobs.
Right.
We want to be the most productive place in the world, and we are. But the fact of the matter is, if our factories were just as productive today and across the world as they were in 1992, 30 million more Americans would be working today. David, what you just said is the case. It is the challenge of our time.
I agree with that.
To figure out how to grow this economy, not for the rich, but for the middle class and for the working class. There has been such a hollowing out over the past 20, 25, 30 years that it's absolutely devastating. We keep falling further and further behind. And it's too simple for Republicans to blame whatever Republicans are going to blame on Barack Obama. It's too simple for Democrats to say this has all happened because of George W. Bush's tax cuts. I wish it were just that simple. It is not that simple. We are facing forces that, generational forces, the same forces that TR had to tame back in the early 20th century, where he had to deal with all the excesses of the Industrial Revolution. We now have to figure out how to deal with the excesses of the IT revolution. There are challenges there. There's also some great news there, too. You look what's happening in Detroit. You look what's happening where Ford and the UAW are coming together and working. You look what's happening with the energy revolution. We were supposed to be out of natural gas in the next 10, 15 years. It's just exploded. We now have an unlimited supply. By 2020, we're going to be the #1 exporter of oil in the world. Bismarck was right. There's a divine providence that protects fools, drunkards, and the United States of America. We have stumbled into it again. I don't know how, but thank you, God. We actually can rebuild a manufacturing base because we have the most productive people in the world. We're going to have some of the cheapest energy costs in the world, and also we've got the most, we've got some of the greatest creative minds. And this whole idea of outsourcing jobs, I'm sure you've seen this. Jeff Immelt and a lot of other CEOs that thought outsourcing was all the rage 10 years ago are now realizing, no, it's not all the rage, because if we have to build it overseas and then wait for it to be shipped here, then we're going to be a step behind our competitors who put it on the drawing board and then take it to the assembly line, and then fix it and put it out and send it to somebody who's ordered the product and get it out there in 2 or 3 days. I think we have some great possibilities here, but my party especially, my party has to realize that it's not about growing wealth of the 1%. It's about doing what Margaret Thatcher talked about doing. When she talked 1975, she talked about a revolution in Great Britain. Nobody thought Margaret Thatcher could turn the conservative movement around. But in 75, when she took over the Conservatives, she said our greatest goal is spreading wealth out to the most people in Great Britain. And when we figure out how to do that, we're going to take back Parliament. And they did.
I, by the way, share your enthusiasm for the rebirth of the auto industry. I'm glad the president intervened to keep it from collapsing and dying.
Yeah.
So with that, let me take some questions.
Seriously, David, I fly all the way out to Chicago and you end it that way?
Exactly.
Actually, if you'll remember, David, I actually opposed the bank bailout because I thought, 3 pages and $700 billion was an atrocious way to do it.
Right.
But I was actually supportive of the auto bailout, and I thought it was extraordinary that some of the same people that blindly gave the big banks on Wall Street $700 billion were somehow going to allow the Midwest to die.
Well, and your man Ratner did a great job on that. But let me just say this. You should be the last person to complain about someone cold cocking you on the way out the door, because I could go to an ad right now, and it would be...
Wait till you're on my show again, David.
Okay.
Good point.
Let's take some questions. Let's start right here.
Thank you. First, it's enlightening to see that the loafers without socks is not just an on-TV myth.
No. This is a Florida problem, even in Chicago.
Yeah, it's cold out there,
I know.
Thank you. In the beginning, you mentioned how you were inspired by Bobby Kennedy and how now if we could have 10 of them in Congress, what a difference it would make. Had you been had you been in Congress today, would you be one of the 10? And now, as a popular host on MSNBC, which role do you find more fulfilling? And where would you place your voice in the conservative landscape of America today? Or in general, for the...
Can we just take your top 3
You
questions?
know, I went to University of Alabama. If you think I'm going to remember all of this stuff.
Why don't we
I can remember those.
Why don't we stop them right here and let them answer those 3?
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody go to Alabama here, undergrad? All right, there you go. So we're not good at some of this stuff. Not good at math. But we don't have to be, because every year we only have to count to number 1. Anyway, any Notre Dame fans here? Yes. All right, look, raise your hands. Gentlemen, sir, you're a Notre Dame fan? What's the name of your imaginary girlfriend? I always say, David, in the SEC, we play real football and we have real girlfriends. Anyway, ba-doom boom. I knew I could get somebody in Chicago to raise their hands, right? So I forgot all of your questions. Thank you very much for coming. So I can tell you this. So I'm asked a lot, do you enjoy being on TV more, or do you enjoy being in Congress more? I enjoy what I'm getting paid on TV a lot more. I get to meet a lot of people, and it's all exciting, but it doesn't even come close to how fulfilling being in Congress was. I would, my family lived back in the district, and I commuted back and forth, so I would be there for 3.5, 4 days a week. I'd get to the office at 6:30 in the morning. I would look up at the clock at 9 at night and go, damn, I only have 2 more hours. And I loved every second of it, because not only did I love the issues, and I was seen as a very ideological guy at the time, I also learned pretty quickly that you could really help people. I know that sounds glib, but nobody comes up to me anymore as ideologically conservative as I was. When I go back to Pensacola, my hometown, nobody comes up to me and goes, you know what, I loved how you shut down the government and helped balance the budget, or man, welfare reform was great, or boy, that regulatory reform bill, blah, blah. No. They'll come up to you and they'll say, you know what, my granddad was having trouble getting his VA benefits, and nobody would help us out. We called your office, and you picked up the phone, and you called the VA, and you demanded action, or said that there was going to be problems in the committee. And my dad, got the check the next week. Or, the IRS. Somebody from Alabama one time said, my dad lived in your district, and, the IRS was pushing them around. They'd been auditing them for 5 years. They were about to lose their family farm. They called you up, you picked up the phone and said to the IRS, listen, if they've broken the law, send them to jail. But either charge them or get the hell off their farm. And the next week, the IRS got the hell off their farm. And you've got a chance to really help people there. And it really, it's extraordinarily rewarding. Your question about where would I be in the Republican Party, I won't mention the person's name, but a guy called me up screaming at me saying I was no longer a conservative because I criticized Rush. That was the new definition of whether you're a conservative or not. And I just laughed and I said, get used to it. You're in my party. We're going to win in the end. I think I'm right in the middle of the Republican Party. I can tell you. Again, I've been out, Meek and I have given 300, 400 speeches over the past several years, and everywhere we go, I've yet to have a Republican come up to me and say, man, you are just way too liberal. I think most Republicans are like me. They think the party in Washington, D.C. has gone too far. Your third question was, would I be one of the 10 or 11 if I were there now? Well, if I weren't, I wouldn't be there. That's the thing, time and time again. We stood up not only to Bill Clinton, we stood up to Newt Gingrich. People thought we were absolutely crazy. We got into a lot of fights with Gingrich. At one point, he stripped out all the funding for all the military bases in my district. I remember walking away shocked and stunned, thinking, how am I going to explain this to my district? That 5 military bases are not going to be funded next year because I pissed off the Speaker of the House. And he's going, I feel really bad. I was telling Matt Salmon this. I go, God, I feel so bad, Matt. So many people are going to hurt. And Matt said, he's congressman from Arizona. He goes, you know what, Joe? It's really their own fault. I go, why? He goes, well, they voted for you in the first place. I said, thanks for being with me as I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. But yeah, I mean, my feeling is, it's just like I said about John Boehner. If you're not going to try to make a difference, if you're not going to try to change the world, you know what, just stay home. You know, there's so many people up there that are just glad to wear the uniform, you know, on Friday night and stand on the sidelines and say, look at me. Why? Life's too short.
There are a lot of people in here who I think have plans to change the world, so why don't we take a few more questions? I want to let you have the last one, but here, there's a hand up there.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments about the hollowing out of the middle class over the last 25 years. And also your comments about Reagan and Thatcher, which might be 30, 35 years ago.
Right.
In your opinion, is there a connection between the two?
Between Reagan and Thatcher and the hollowing out of the middle class? No. Because if you look at what's happening across the world, if you look at what's happening in industrialized nations, especially in the West, where the IT revolution has taken off, you just see the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. We have a progressive president right now. I think most of us would agree in here, except for maybe the Marxists, the 11% Marxists. We have a fairly progressive president. By the time Barack Obama gets out of office, you're going to see that trend line continue. The rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. If it were easy as raising taxes and raising taxes and raising taxes up to 50, 60, 70% to somehow create a more equitable society, I think people would be proposing it.
So Ronald Reagan did say, in pushing his tax reform, do you think it's fair that a millionaire should pay a lower tax rate than a bus driver? He did push the earned income tax credit so people who worked wouldn't live in poverty.
Oh, right, yeah.
And shouldn't the Republican Party embrace those principles?
You know, I don't understand why the Republican Party wouldn't embrace something like what Warren Buffett suggested, which is we all pay, at the very least, a minimum of 30% in taxes. It's absolutely obscene that people making $1 billion on Wall Street have a 14% tax rate. That's absolutely obscene. I've said it before on TV. It's immoral when people that are doing, you know, their administrative work are paying 27, 28% taxes. I think these are the sort of things we should support. Republicans should also be for breaking up the big banks. The big banks that were too big to fail on September 15th, 2008 are too big to fail on November 14th, 2013. The fact that nobody has been sent to jail that wrecked our economy, the fact that nobody has been sent to jail that ruined people's lives, people who've been working their entire life to see their pensions dissolve overnight. Why aren't we for that? Why aren't we for breaking up banks? What happens if Citibank goes under tomorrow? What happens if JP Morgan goes under tomorrow? What happens if Bank of America goes under tomorrow? What happens if Wells Fargo goes under tomorrow? You know what happens? You pay again for their screw-ups. Now, I'm sorry. I think a Republican being for the breaking up of the banks, being for a minimum 30% tax, I think that Republican would do pretty well in Iowa, in New Hampshire, in South Carolina, in Florida. I really do. And I still don't know why John Huntsman was the only candidate in 2012 that openly talked about breaking up the big banks. They're still too big to fail.
Didn't do very well in Iowa and all those other places. But
he did all right in New Hampshire, but then again, I think a strong Republican candidate could do well.
Two more questions. Yeah, Chris.
I'll answer these faster so we can take more. I promise.
Well, on Tuesday, we'll be honoring the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, as one of the most infamous Republicans in the history of the United States. And I just wanted to ask you to put in your own words how you feel those principles set forth in that speech are relevant to the context of what we're doing today here in the United States.
Yeah, I was fearful. We had Ken Burns on, who actually had people reciting the Gettysburg Address. I was really afraid you were going to ask me to recite it. It's just, I think, it's such an extraordinary speech. John Meacham talks about how that speech, you know, it was the most important, most influential, most powerful speech in American politics up until Martin Luther King's speech in August of 1963, and I agree. You know, obviously, there's so many great parts of it, but, you know, a government of the people, by the people, for the people is something that I wish people in Washington, D.C. would have emblazoned on their walls every day. And it's an incredible speech. It's also, I think, David, a great message for politicians and people that have 3-hour TV shows like myself, that sometimes saying less is more. It was such a short speech.
Right, less than 3 minutes.
Less than 3 minutes, but so incredibly moving. I can't even answer a question in less than 3 minutes.
Yeah, and it's hard to fill a 3-hour show with less than 3 minutes, but yeah, let me take one over here, and then we'll finish up here.
Hi, you mentioned John Boehner's lack of leadership with the Republican Party. How do you think Barack Obama stands as a leader in the Democratic Party?
Oh, dear Lord. I thought I would escape this. You know,
Better cancel your afternoons.
It's not like I don't say this on TV every day, so this won't be shocking to David. And David will disagree with absolutely everything that I say now. I think the president got elected too early. I think if he had been elected in 2012 for the first time, or 2016, if he understood Washington, D.C. more, I think he would have, and how Washington works, I think he would have been a much more effective leader. I don't think he likes Washington. I know he doesn't like Washington. I know he doesn't like sort of doing the grubby little things, like calling over people with whom you disagree strongly, and working relationships over and over and over again. You can't just invite people over one time to see a movie. It doesn't work that way. It's hard work. And I'm not saying that the president disdains hard work, but I think David knows this much better than me, and he's really in no place to talk about it. But I was joking about Bill Clinton. He loves this stuff. He's sick. Like, in all the ways you have to be sick to be elected president of the United States. He wants to go back as first dude. I mean, he can't get enough of this stuff. And I think sometimes the unpleasantries of politics sometimes are a bit too much for President Obama to swallow. Only because it is. I mean, it can be a really demeaning thing. Bill Clinton told me one time, because people were joking about how we were getting along, about how I had led the charge with the torches to impeach him. And he said, Joe, politics requires that you don't have a short memory. It requires that you have no memory. I don't see, I'm just saying this, again, I feel a little self-conscious with David here, but not enough to stop from actually talking. I don't see that George W. Bush or Barack Obama had a real love for Washington, D.C., and what it took to be a success in the way that, say, Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan did. And now I'll turn it over to David so he can tell me why.
I'd just say a couple of things about this. One is that I don't think it's about love of Washington when 15 leading members of the opposition meet on inaugural night to talk about how they can thwart the administration, or when the majority, or the Republican leader in the Senate, does an interview in January of 2010, says we had a strategy not to work with him on any major project because that would signify that he had figured it out and we weren't going to give it to him. We had many members when I was in the White House over, and long discussions on issues, including health care, in which they said, well, I agree with you, but, I can't buck the leadership on this. And so, I don't doubt, he's not, I think he enjoys politics. I think he enjoys it particularly out when he's among people. I don't think this is a matter of him not schmoozing enough. I don't think that that history would be particularly different because there had been a strategic decision made, and that strategic decision was to block everything that they could, and I regret that. But I do say this, Joe.
You act, though, like he's the first president that had a hostile opposing party. George W. Bush was absolutely hated and loathed by Democrats, was called a Nazi for years, but he decided that we needed a surge in Iraq, a surge which I'll just say I opposed because I thought Bush had screwed up the war so much he didn't deserve any more leash to screw up the war. You had an LA Times poll that showed only 12% of Americans supported it, but Bush worked it, and he worked it hard at a time when Democrats were trying to kill him, and he got it passed. I mean,
no. And we started the administration by dealing with, I always say that we start off by doing a series of things, each of which were as necessary as they were unpopular. The Recovery Act, the TARP that you talked about, and making it work because we inherited that, and the auto, none of them were popular.
I will say, and you've said this before, I've got to say 3 or 4 months into it, the president had to do such big things and such unpopular things that he was labeled. 3 months in, big government, liberal. When the fact of the matter is, you and I both know George W. Bush would have done the same thing. But there's no doubt the start of this administration made it about as hard for him to reach out to the center aisle as the start of the Bush administration after the contested 2000 election, for a lot of different reasons.
And each time we had a discussion about the politics and how bad the politics were, and each time he said, yeah, but we got a responsibility here. And to me, that is the definition of leadership.
So let me ask you this, because I think this is important. I'm sure you talk about it all the time. Think about the last 3 presidents that we've had. You had George W. Bush, who talked about being a uniter and not a divider, and all the stories coming out of Austin, Texas, talked about how Bush worked with Democrats famously. Barack Obama, his 2004 speech, I was just saying the other night, one of the most inspiring speeches I've ever heard. We don't live in a red state America, we live in the United States of America. And then Bill Clinton, who was a guy that had to figure out how to work with conservatives in Arkansas. What is it about Washington, D.C., when you have these people who think they're going to come and be uniters, actually become a part of a process that gets more and more ugly?
No, I think this is something that we have to solve, obviously, because we're spinning madly. It gets worse and worse with each succeeding administration. One of my concerns is that, if we have a Democratic Congress that they'll adopt some of the practices of this of Republicans, House Republicans. So I think we have to break this cycle. But part of it, and we didn't talk about it, is the structure of how people get elected, particularly to the House, and the homogenous nature of these districts, where you get rewarded for recalcitrance, and you don't pay a political price, and you only have to look over your left shoulder or your right shoulder, depending on whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. I think we should fundamentally reform the way we draw these districts so that we make more competitive districts.
People used to always ask me, what's the number one thing, if you could pass anything that you wanted to change Congress? I always said term limits. I don't say that anymore. We've got to stop the gerrymandering of the districts. My only hope as a Republican is what happened in the special election down in Alabama, where you had the Chamber of Commerce come in and say, okay, we're getting off the crazy train now. We're going to fund the Main Street Republican instead of the Tea Party Republican. And they did, and they won. And I hope that message is sent to more Republicans who come from districts where, you're right, they're not punished. for doing some things that really damage the Republican Party's national brand.
And in fact, they're rewarded for it. I got to defer your question. You have to have it in a sidebar, John. I'm sorry for that because we ran out of time here. But the book is The Right Path. It's available over here. I know some of you.
Can I ask you?
Yes.
What?
Yes.
Does
the sexiest woman alive.
Does David usually bring this to class? Because
the God's honest truth is,
if he does, I may want to sign up for that class. There you go.
The God's honest truth is, I didn't know how interesting you'd be, Joe, and I just brought this along.
It happens.
Drag.
I understand.
There's a poll in here. There's a poll in here on the new political center.
Sure
and I was
there
going
is,
to quote
David.
from it. It just happens to be in the Sexiest Woman Alive edition.
So David reads the magazine for the articles.
Anyway, thank you all for being here. I hope you'll all stop and have a book signed, and we really appreciate you being here, Joe.
Thank you, guys.